Venezuela 101. Welcome to a new episode and a new season of Venezuela 101.
Just as we announced in the trailer for this season, from now on we will be incorporating some changes in Venezuela 101, such as publishing episodes in Spanish as well and recording thematic seasons.
That's right. This season, we will address, with various experts, the crisis of Venezuelan refugees and migrants, attempting to consider all perspectives that affect the diaspora.
I also believe it's worth noting, Melanio, that the podcast format will remain the same. Interviews with experts that allow us to delve into key aspects of the situation in Venezuela.
Now, given that, in recent months, the human rights situation in the country has been severely affected, we have decided to start with a zero episode that provides context to the audience of what is currently happening in Venezuela, or at least so far this year.
I believe that if we review the events chronologically, we can see how repression and systematic human rights violations have been increasing even since the end of last year. As early as October 2023, the date of the primaries to choose the opposition candidate in this year's presidential election, a series of irregularities were observed around the process. For example, despite the fact that Maria Corina Machado was elected as the candidate with more than 2 million votes, the regime, through the Supreme Court of Justice, attempted to invalidate the process and issued a supposed reaffirmation of disqualification against her, dating back to 2021, which prevents her from holding or being elected to public office for the next 15 years. Subsequently, the regime's prosecutor, Tariq William Saab, appointed 2 prosecutors to investigate the organizing committee of the primaries for alleged usurpation of functions from the Electoral Authority, and this investigation has been the pretext to persecute and intimidate members of the primary commission. This same investigation resulted in the arbitrary detention of Roberto Abdul on December 6, 2023, who remained detained for 14 days in the political prison of El Helicoide, while his human rights were violated and any respect for due process was disregarded.
Following this, as you mentioned, Miguel, in January of this year, the Attorney General announced the discovery of alleged assassination plans, and from then on, another wave of arbitrary detentions ensued. In fact, on that same day, the Attorney General announced that there were 32 people, including civilians and military personnel, detained. And the next day, the persecution of leaders of the Vente Venezuela party began, which reported the forced disappearance of 3 of its regional leaders. Let's remember that Vente Venezuela is the political party of the presidential candidate elected in the primary, Maria Corina Machado, who, on January 26, also had her political disqualification ratified for a period of 15 years.
Let's also remember that on that same day, when Maria Corina Machado's disqualification was ratified, the regime called for the activation of the Bolivarian Fury Plan, a plan that, according to the same experts from the UN fact-finding mission, has been used on other occasions to repress and persecute political dissent. And, as on other occasions, following this call, more than 20 headquarters of political, social, professional, and human rights defender organizations were threatened, their facades were marked and painted. And shortly thereafter, on February 9th, Rocio San Miguel, a lawyer and human rights defender, was a victim of forced disappearance and later arbitrary detention, along with 5 of her relatives. The relatives have been released, but Rocio and her ex-husband remain detained to this date.
In fact, on February 15th, the regime announced the expulsion of officials from the technical office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from the country and gave them 72 hours to leave the country after the office spoke out against the forced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and violation of due process in the case of Rocio San Miguel. Now, another detention that caused shock in February was that of engineer Carlos Salazar, a civilian, a citizen who, without being an activist or a political leader, was detained in the state of Nueva Esparta after recording Alex Saab while he was shopping at a shopping center. Mr. Carlos was forcibly disappeared and is currently in the political prison El Helicoide in Caracas, that is, more than 370 kilometers from where he was arbitrarily detained. This fact also prevents visits from his relatives.
March was not very different. Melanio, let's remember that Emil Brandt, Jovila Mizar, Henry Alviares, and Dinora Hernandez were arbitrarily detained, and arrest warrants were issued against Oswaldo Bracho, Pedro Uruchurtu, Omar González Moreno, Humberto Villalobos, Claudia Maquero, Fernando Martínez Motola, and Magali Meda, all members of the Vente Venezuela party, all part of Maria Corina Machado's campaign team. Additionally, the leader of La Causa R, Wilfer Piña Azuaje, and Renzo Estibens Flores were also arbitrarily detained. And now in April, the NGO Fotopenal reported that at least 30 political prisoners have been transferred since February 19th from the DGCM headquarters to the El Rodeo judicial internship without informing the relatives of the detainees or the public who are the ones transferred, or what is the cause of the change. To this is added that on April 15th, journalist and neighborhood activist Carlos Julio Rojas was intercepted by hooded men and taken against his will when he was in La Candelaria, Caracas. Carlos Julio is also detained.
All this, Miguel, amidst the announcement of the electoral calendar for the presidential elections, which are supposed to be held on July 28th, and for which there are still no full guarantees or conditions. In fact, during the candidate registration period, the Democratic Unity platform constantly denounced the irregularities of the process, including the impossibility of registering Corina Yoris, a candidate who had been endorsed by Maria Corina Machado.
I want to emphasize that we are also talking about this happening in just the last 3 months, not to mention the daily violations suffered by political prisoners or the persecution and risk faced by leaders. The reality is that today it doesn't matter if you are an activist, if you are a political leader, if you are an office or an organization like the Office of the High Commissioner or an ordinary citizen. The regime increases the repressive escalation every day, which is why we consider it important to make this episode as a recount to understand the context in which Venezuela finds itself today.
It is very true, and one of the most worrying things is that the media are subjected to censorship and self-censorship imposed by the state's communication hegemony. Threats, persecution, harassment, and selective attacks on social media against those who still express what is really happening in the country are part of the factors that prevent civil society, Venezuelans in general, from being aware that all these things are happening simultaneously. And in the absence of news, in the absence of information, it is important that spaces like this remain denouncing, explaining, and trying to give context to a slightly wider audience of what is happening in our country.
That's right, Melanio. Thanks to those who listen to us, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with the first episode about Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Remember that you can share this episode and follow us on Instagram, Venezuela101_.